A warm welcome to the Respectful Nettheatrechannel. Today is the 28th of November 2022. In our today's episode, we will speak about infrastructures, institutions, collective identities in the situation of great crisis in digital cultures. Our guests are Orit Halpern. She's a full professor and chair of digital cultures and societal change at Technische Universität Dresden, Germany. She has just started the new position, and congratulations from our side and all the best for it. And we have Nishant Shah, professor of aesthetic and culture and of technologies at Artes, University of the Arts in Arnhem, in the Netherlands. And we have Fred Turner, professor of communication at Stanford University in the USA. Before going deeper to our topic, let me shortly introduce the Respectful Nettheatrechannel to you. This project, launched by Judith Ackermann, Anusha Gosalka, Kai Tuchmann, and myself in summer 2021, attempts to understand the role of theater and performance in and for digital cultures. We do so in conversations with artists from theater performance and scholars from the humanities or technical sciences. We also do performative research on our digital stage on TikTok, experiencing and reflecting the interplay of how we are performed by the algorithmic agencies and how the human players try to perform them. The starting point to discuss our today's topic is a quite paradoxical situation within digital cultures, which comes up within their being in severe crisis. We see on the one side a necessity to work on a decolonization and diversification of cultural institutions and technological infrastructures, finding its materialization in, amongst others, an organization of the social in collectives. On the other side, we see at the same time within this drive a kind of re-essentialisation of identity concerning, for example, gender and language. The question rises if there is a renaissance of fixed and material identities in left and right identity politics, undergoing the model of the constitution of identity as performative, culturally generated, as proposed since the 1980s and 90s in, for example, feministic theory and research. Both developments take place in digital cultures as those of crisis with an existential menace, like, for example, climate change, the perhaps not so serious breakdown of capitalist economies or of democracy. A lot of question arises. Concerning global diversification in the context of crisis, one question is about the influence of the technological conditions of digital cultures, enabling infrastructures as well as politics and regimes of hyperconnectivity. Are they promoting collectivity and even leading to global economies and politics, as well as to questioning colonial structures, practices, and policies at the same time? If so, how must digital technologies be constructed in order to support a more equal society instead of hindering it? Another question is, which new forms of power could come up with a reconfiguration to collectivity? And what can we learn from the history of digital cultures since the 1960s concerning problematic politics within this form of social organization, as seen in art, performance, as well as in labs at the same time? The aim for historical framing is to learn from the past in order to not do the same mistakes today. As for the supposed re-essentialisation of identity, the question comes up if this may be linked to technological conditions too, as for example, the homophilic constitution of networks and algorithmic processing, empowering non-ambiguous authentication. Theater as institution and performance in the larger sense of aesthetic and embodied undertaking may have a special role in this context. Concerning the question of identity, they may be interesting because of the ambiguity of role play, blending and bleeding the so-called person, figures, and roles. Relating to collective, theater and performance are of interest as they build from collective processes. including diverse social and functional tasks depending on each other, and people working together, always fighting with hierarchies and injustice. I admit, these are huge topics, bringing together in a very ambitious way hyper-complex situations and conditions. Our today's episode is the first try to step into this complexity and important task as we deal with situations of severe crisis, as said, and the necessity to organize technology, society, and ourselves. We are more than happy to venture this first step with our guests, as they are specialists in these topics and questions and brave thinkers of complexity. Orit Halpern, for example, bridges in her research the history of science, computing, and cybernetics with design. This is part of her first book, Beautiful Data, A History of Vision and Reason from 2015, investigating in histories of big data, design, and governmentality. She's currently working on 2 big projects. One of these examines extreme infrastructures and the history of experimentation at planetary scales in design, science, and engineering. And in her current book, together with Robert Mitchell, which is entitled The Smartness Mandate, exploring the obsession of smart technologies and artificial intelligence. Concerning the question of power in collectives, Nishant Shah has offered an essay on collectives and diversity in institutions, speaking about a weaponization of care. As knowledge partner of Oxfam Novit, Netherlands, and the Digital Asia Hub, Hong Kong and Singapore, he's working at, as he says, the intersections of body, identity, digital technologies, artist practice, and activism. His current interest is in questioning digital narratives and practices, bringing them towards building inclusive, diverse, resilient, and equitable societies. And Fred Turner could help, amongst a lot of other things, to understand the history and the present of technology, art, and their politics in social organization and human engineering, with his publications as L'usage de l'art dans le Silicon Valley, or The Democratic Surround, Multimedia and American Liberalism from World War II to the Psychedelic 60s from 2013, and From Counterculture to Cyberculture, Stuart Brand and the Whole Earth Catalog Network from 2006. It is this hippie counterculture fighting against rigid politics and with techno-aesthetic collectives and psychedelic performances that could be seen, as Fred states, as a prehistory of the alt-right movement in the USA. Now we will start with the short inputs of our guests. And we will start with Fred, followed by Orit and Nishant, and then come up to a conversation and discussions. Thanks a lot. So, Fred, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you, Martina. Great. I'm really happy and honored to be here with you and with Orit and with Nishant. I mean, this is a great group. I feel very lucky to be here. So thanks. So you described the complexity of our moment, I think, very accurately. And I want to name a couple of features that I think are actually anchored in the intersection of earlier technologies, theater, and dreams of a kind of digital society that would be more democratic than a mass media alternative. We live at a time when we have this paradox. On the one hand, we're building global systems that are highly centralized. These are platforms and other things. But we're living lives and we're solicited by those systems as individuals, and we are rendered ever more individual. And this combination of constant centralization and constant individualization doesn't fit in the stories that we have about how power works. We've inherited stories from the middle of the 20th century, from World War II, about domination as a process of top-down, hierarchical, one-to-many oppression. In that story, running up now from the 50s, the 60s, and 70s, the job of freeing people was the job of freeing us to become ever more ourselves, to become ever more authentically who we were inside ourselves, and to bring that insideness out into the world. And, you know, we had names for these social forms that we developed for this purpose: demonstrations, when we marched in the 1960s, we demonstrated, not in the United States, not only against the war, but we demonstrated how we felt inside. We were angry, we were unhappy. We also demonstrated new ways of carrying our body, new ways of being a person. Men could have long hair, women could wear pants. I know these things are not new anymore, but at the time, these were violations of the gender norms that were there. And out of that moment, particularly out of civil rights and out of gay activism and later queer activism, out of feminism, we built a society that was culturally organized around the production of authentic individual expression. We did that just before we created a technology that was incredibly good at tracking our individual expressions and transforming them into new modes of profit making. In essence, we developed a kind of way of bringing to the surface the social ore of our personal emotional lives just at a moment when we had also created a technology and an economic mechanism for mining that ore. And those two things have worked together. Now, this is where the earlier language of collectivity that you use makes me very uncomfortable. You know, in the 60s story, the collective, the community, is what runs against the hierarchy. It's what fascism is not. Fascism is precisely not intimacy, collectivity, community, that feeling of friendship and working together that builds a commune. It's precisely not that. Yet, our own era has seen a rise in a kind of mode of individuation that I think renders us deeply vulnerable to the new forms of centralization that are occurring. If we imagine that the continued pursuit of expressive individualism is what will free us, we are doing nothing but feeding the beast that we have just built. That's not where freedom lies. And this is the perverse thing. And this is the thing that in America, particularly, we have a lot of trouble thinking about. Because in America, we are so focused on individualism, on individual expression, on individual life, on the ability to pursue my own happiness. With that mindset, it's difficult to step back and say, wait a minute, it may be that in order to become more free, we need to embrace structures that guarantee freedom for people who are very unlike one another. And the answer to our freedom may actually be, to some degree, building in good constraints. And this is the paradox. This is the paradox, I think, of our time. All right, I will wrap up with just a quick thought about theater proper. So in the 50s and 60s, theater, particular styles of theater, happenings, John Cage's musical performances, later psychedelic events, these were all events designed to give us the experience of being one being with other beings, finally interconnected, simultaneously ourselves, but also members of a global organic community. And Orit has written about these kinds of things. I have too, and they're fascinating, right? It's a sort of cybernetic ideal. We can all be connected through the exchange of information and vibes and feelings. Those moments were incredibly culturally legitimate. They made the cover of Life magazine. And they legitimated the mode of being that we now inhabit, a mode of being centered around individual expression in collective settings. They made that seem incredibly cool. And it was a great alternative to the button-down world of mainstream Cold War America. But it's precisely what troubles us now. Donald Trump is an expert in creating the mass feeling of emotional togetherness. The emotional togetherness we inhabit now is the emotional togetherness of the crowd, the mass. It's precisely what the democratic institutions of the Enlightenment were designed to prevent, to forestall. So my view is that theater in the 50s and 60s, in its experimental mode, legitimated the rise of an expressive style that at the time was extraordinarily liberating, but that has left us vulnerable to a new structure and infrastructure that is predatory, authoritarian, and a problem. And so our challenge now is to build new structures or to reinforce ones that we already have, that may constrain that individual expression just a bit, but that would reorganize our discussions of freedom around the sharing of resources among people who are fundamentally very different than one another. So I'll hold there.
Okay, thanks a lot, dear Fred. I just will give over to Orit.
Well, for starters, thanks. It's a real privilege to be here with such an amazing group. I don't know if I probably only have an extension of Fred's very eloquent and extremely well organized discussion to extend, except to say this. In our present moment, there's clearly a demand to try to think about, for lack of a better word, civil rights, which I think is what you're talking about, which is actually the rights to political enfranchisement and to the question of how do we live in diverse societies with people we do not identify or affiliate with. And that this is kind of a fundamental question, and that it appears right now that our technical condition is augmenting or abetting forces that are disinterested in this goal. There are, of course, many, many legitimate critiques as well, of course, of democracy, liberalism, and other things that we're currently in the process of trying to understand how we're going to reinvent and redefine. For my current work, to be honest, which a lot has to do with financialization, there is a question also that perhaps mirrors Fred's discourse, but I don't know if I would exactly sit with it, because I'm a little wary, to be honest, of the kind of critique of feminism, queer, these kind of movements as sort of eroding democratic politics. But I would say that obviously we do live in an age where there's concerns about how we understand this relationship between individualism and structure. And moreover, there's interesting questions about how we've redefined freedom and agency over the last 40 or 50 years, particularly since the 1970s. And one of the things that strikes me the most when I've been looking at the work of people developing technologies in algorithmic trading and in neoliberal thinking is the fundamental kind of assumption that almost the greatest freedom is the freedom not to be conscious, actually. The kind of fantasy of a self-organizing system. It's one of the opening moments, actually, of neoliberal thinking in the 1940s, where where figures like Friedrich Hayek say, that no human being is possibly objective, and therefore only markets, only networks at scale can make decisions, because individuals, and on one hand, that sounds great, like, wow, finally critique of Enlightenment thinking, a subjective perspective. But, it's really interesting to think about this idea of the kind of fantasy, not only of collectivity, and I think this might reiterate what Fred kind of meant in terms of what it means to have a political collective, which has an interest in representation and perhaps translating a particular message into a demos, into a site where, at least in Greek thought, the people come to be seen, to power, but rather this idea that we're all partial, and that is only through kind of networked collectivities that that decisions get made, and the best networked collectivity being the market in the case of economics, but obviously one could see the extension of this. And what's really interesting is along with that comes a kind of shift. If we think about John Mills or other original liberal thinkers, the idea was that democracy was an experiment on the self. So it also had this question of the self, which is probably maybe a fundamental problem with liberalism and its relationship to technology in our present. But fundamentally, it was supposed to be hard work. Like, you were constantly supposed to be learning or working. Citizenship was supposed to be a challenge or trial, a kind of project of discovery of some sort that aligned itself with ideals of scientific investigation. And like I said, there's so much we can critique about that. But what's very interesting is that if we look at the discourse post 1970s, you're seeing an idea not of freedom as a sort of freedom around experimentation or a representation or a challenge that freedom is actually something that's constantly needs to be worked for and aspired to, but rather freedom is a freedom from coercion and a right to participate mainly in collective networks, and again, the market being the most prevalent one. And so this idea of freedom and convenience, actually, which maybe we see actualized on our platforms or Amazons or these sort of things, has a kind of a critical and dangerous intersection, which has also positioned in many ways, at least, and again, I'm speaking for the United States, has positioned things like intellectualism or excess, difficulty essentially as a kind of antagonism to freedom, or any obstacle to immediate, to kind of your community or your group or yourself, aspiring perhaps maybe to self-actualization. Any sort of obstacle to that becomes kind of a negative, and easily seen as negative. So I mark that is a major issue. The second thing that I'm really concerned about these days is actually neo-Malthusianism. That there's a new challenge, not a new, but interestingly, I'm trying to still understand its relationship to technology, because one might also imagine in a cyborg mode that technologies might emancipate us from biological and natural ideas of race and reproduction. But that currently the fantasy of the self-organizing network is also coinciding with a return to Malthusian understandings that bodies are only worth what they are as labor. And you see this emerging in discourses from the fact that suddenly everyone's worried that there's too few people on Earth, but only in certain places, of course, and only, and mostly this is both gendered, raced, and and a lot about elite white nations concerned about immigration, to the fact that we're seeing extreme transformations in ideas of how people understand abortion and reproductive decision-making and its allowances. And so that is a second feature that I'm finding to be extremely vital, that has coincided. So a sort of return to nature of a weird form that has come after the sort of, one would have thought, a kind of perhaps post-Anthropocene, we thought nature and culture were gone, but somehow it's come back. And so for me, these two forces of actually kind of a neo-Malthusian extreme racial politics that's actually returned to discourse, and it seems in weird ways reaffirmed and valorized, not only through our internet networks, but through strange kind of maybe some intense new relationships between how people understand the body and technology, recombined with a kind of fantasy about freedom as solely freedom from coercion, and perhaps, as Fred put it, a freedom to kind of in this hyper individualized mode, but not in the interest of kind of having to make an effort for others. So for me, this kind of new question of neoliberalism meets neo-Malthusianism, which also intersects with both racial politics and religious politics in all sorts of places, are sort of the biggest things that are, well, those are the main things I'm working on and are super concerned in, and trying to understand why in the midst of a world like today, we are seeing the return of these discourses. Now, of course, they were very prevalent in the 60s in reverse. People were worried about the population bomb. And this was an explicitly racist and developmental thing, which, for good or for bad, it was environmentally destructive, but it does feed the world, was dealt with through the Green Revolution. And somehow right now, there's an interesting question about the resurgence in a kind of inverse way around normative bodies and aging and stuff like that, of a kind of new concept of which bodies are valuable and which are not, and which need to be propagated, without a kind of consideration that there are indeed so many other mechanisms available to us in order to sustain fruitful societies. So those are the concerns I have. I don't know if that answers. This doesn't bring much about performance, except that obviously For me, there's been a whole question of performance, particularly in finance, the performativity of models and theories, and the way that we often think that they're just out there in the world, but and that they represent something, but they actually create markets. That there's been a feedback loop through the that we've seen of the financialization of everyday life, but now into crypto, NFTs, which is kind of interesting. Link also to this this project of self expression, I guess, in terms of self minting. But the fact that those sort of entities act as kind of actors in a way, and are themselves not just representing, but actually doing and performing, and often performing without actually validation. I mean, one of the interesting things Milton Friedman first said is you can't really ever evaluate economics. He would be like, because it's like astronomy, you can't do an experiment, you know, on anything this big. So, you know, it's really wrong to attack economic models on their assumptions. And this was a fundamental tenet and has continued to be one. So it creates a really interesting question of performance, and but of course, at a different scale and in a different mode than, let's say, in theater. Saw in there.
Okay, thanks a lot, Orit. I will hand over to Nishant.
All right. This is a daunting task because I think between Orit and Fred, they've kind of painted the whole world. And I don't know how to kind of color within the lines of what they've kind of put out. But it's a wonderful challenge to have. And thank you for inviting me to be in such amazing company. I think one of the joys of my work is that I get to speak to people whose work I teach my students. And both Fred and Orit fall in that category. So it's so exciting to be here. I am actually going to maybe deviate a little bit. I think because some of the work that we have been doing has been anchored very much in the majority worlds. So we are trying to stay away from categories like global south or global north and so on, and just focusing on geographies and communities where majority of the populations live. Unlike both the previous conversations, which are really brilliant articulations of conceptual crisis in a very embodied way that digital cultures seem to present, I'm going to be small and say, I'm just going to talk about political action. And I know the facetiousness of it, saying it's small, that I'm talking about political action, but it is anchored in a very particular project I have been facilitating over the last couple of years. It's called Doing Things with Stories. And this is how the project actually started. There has been a lot of conversations in civil society groups across majority worlds. And I work with two very large human rights organizations, HIVOS and Oxfam Novib, which are both located in the Netherlands. And we did a study for them, interviewing hundreds of civil society organizations, which are not necessarily formal organizational structures. They were also unstructured collectives, different kinds of social movements, people spanning different geographies, cultures, but also age groups and demands and so on, in order to think about what is going to be the biggest challenge for political action in the face of digitization. And, you know, like a lot of researchers who kind of, we anticipate what we are going to find on the field. And we thought, oh, we're going to know what they're going to talk about. It's going to be surveillance, it's going to be privacy, it's going to be the shrinking space of civic action, it's going to be access, it's going to be infrastructure. And then it came as quite a shock to come back after almost 1 year of interviews to realize that they said the biggest challenge to political action of the future is storytelling. And it took us a while to kind of process this. And it became interesting because they said stories, at least in the ways in which political action has been construed in, let's say, majority worlds, which are progressing towards more democratic and direct forms of engagement, more and more self-governance structures of resilience and so on. Stories have been presented as a way of both setting up collectives, but also nation building, as well as forms of expressing solidarity, right? And particularly when you start thinking about groups and communities which have been struggling to enshrine fundamental civil liberties and human rights for themselves. Think about women, queer people, trans people, Dalits, people, homeless, poor, and so on and so forth. We've often thought about stories are ways by which both the collective is organized, solidarity is expressed, and the nation is built. But these interviews kind of told us that there are three challenges that they are seeing in digital storytelling. First, they say that they seem to have lost the capacity of telling stories that matter. That almost all forms of storytelling they do seems to be a response to particular kinds of crises which are manipulated, engineered, and identified by those who are in power. Which means that a lot of political action and civic energy is right now being diverted to addressing, unraveling, critiquing, understanding, and trying to make sense of crises which are shaped in languages and in protocols and in infrastructures that are not their own. So that was one kind of primary challenge they threw at us. The second thing that came out from that research was to say that even while there is an increased amount of storytelling, I mean, I don't think we have ever said as much as we do in the contemporary times across the different platforms, right? Even if we have nothing to say. I mean, John Cage has almost become a passé. Like we have nothing to say and we are saying it, and that's no longer poetry, that's just Instagram. So there has to be kind of this thing about this almost an obscene, excessive amount of storytelling that's happening. And they said, but within that excess, there is a certain rehearsal of gloom, doom, and despair. We only keep on telling stories about how bad things are. And that seems to be the end point of it, right? That there seems to be a particular tendency, especially by those who have the least to lose and those who are the least affected by the crisis, to continuously reproduce the world in all its despair. Which basically means that for a lot of the civil society organizations and social movement coordinators, there is no more space for inviting people to step into stories as a form of action or activism. If despair is the engineered endpoint, which social media and digital cultures kind of do really well, I mean, think about Twitter as a hate machine and the ways in which people can respond to it. It necessarily means that more and more these stories are actually alienating people from taking specific action and participating, because if the end of the world is near and we're all just going to die, I might as well make popcorn, what somebody said. And then the third challenge they threw at us was that storytelling, especially within the digital networks, precisely because they are so performative in nature, storytelling seems to be an end unto itself, right? That each one of us has devices which can be recording events, which can be capturing phenomena, which can be providing testimony, which can be gathering information. And in all of that, it looks like just producing stories in the service of something that parses, understands, and then makes sense of it seems to be an endpoint of political activism. This is not a regurgitation of the older accusations of slacktivism or armchair activism or Twitter activism and so on and so forth. So they were not saying that, oh, young people are apathetic and they don't do anything except for take a selfie. But they were necessarily saying that there is this cybernetic feedback loop that is put into place where the minute a story is told, there is so much validation, recognition, and seeing of it that we don't seem to think that we need anything more to do beyond that, right? And it's been fascinating in this project called Doing Things with Stories, where we're working with civil society actors, artists, and researchers in trying to think about where are the deadlocks and how do we even articulate some of these things. And then learning from the field itself, I'm not just going to produce this paranoid reading of how bad things are in terms of political action and storytelling. So I thought I'll leave with at least 3 spaces of hope, if we are still allowed to use that word. I'm not particularly sure, but nevertheless 3 spaces of hope, which I think have been interesting. One was perhaps echoing Eve Sedgwick's wonderful provocation that we need to move beyond paranoid readings of the world. We seem to specialize in it. We seem to revel in it. A lot of us make our careers out of it. But the paranoid readings of the world produces paranoid infrastructures of management. If all we can see is that there is a particular paucity of civil liberty, of civil rights, of fundamental human rights, and so on, all we produce are technologies of control and domination, which then do not actually produce and do the work of repair, but continue to perpetuate the damage that they are produced out of. So how do you then tell stories of repair? What is the labor that goes into it? What are the kinds of infrastructures and communities which need to be set into it? And what does it mean to say not cure, but repair? To stay with the brokenness of the world, to acknowledge the people who are being broken and breaking, and work with them to perform then different kinds of repairs. So that was the first thing that was fascinating. The second thing that came out from the project, which I think is very powerful for me at least, is to make the relationship between institutions and crises very clear. That a lot of the public institutions, which were supposed to be in the service of addressing crises and resolving them, seem to be now presented as an embodiment of the crises. Right? Which means that even if you take something like the university, which all the four of us occupy, for instance, the role of the public university had a very specific ambition of what it was supposed to do in terms of addressing social and political crises. Whereas what we have now done is that we have produced these institutions as in a state of crisis without necessarily thinking about who's going to perform the action of these institutions, which are now basically in a condition of self-therapy. Right? Almost every university, instead of trying to think about what happens to the society that it is a part of, is largely just submerged in committee after committee, in hashtag after hashtag of performing its wokeness, performing its equity, and trying to do something about it. So how do you kind of think through the universities not in a state of crisis? Because Alexandra Juhas, who's one of our contributors, so beautifully points out, along with Diana Okala, who's from South Africa, that the idea of the institution immediately produces the notion of competition. A crisis necessitates making choices between two equally deserving goods or two equally deserving bads. And in that particular case, there is no more capacity for solidarity between collectives, because collectives are being organized as battlegrounds. Collectives are being organized as competing for the same scarce resources and being pitted against each other. And that a lot of our digital community making, drawing from the work of people like Wendy Chun, who talk about how homophily and network neighborhoods are produced, but also just thinking through how increasingly we are forming collectives to fight with other collectives, as opposed to making affinities with other collectives and trying to address common questions which are around it. And then the third, and I will kind of end here, was the idea that increasingly we are thinking about people as performances of scale. That instead of thinking through what we are calling economies of intensity, we keep on introducing economies of scale, where the only role that people play in these digital performances of crisis and their solutions is just how many, right? This completely strange phenomena of what Arjun Alampai, who is a digital researcher scholar from Bangladesh, calls quantophilia. This love of just counting and quantifying, and how this kind of leads to both a disembodiment of the performance while still hyper visualizing the body as performing. So you just need a massive number of bodies to perform, but you don't really think about the embodied conditions of the body and the kind of care that is required in that particular process. So these were some of the things that I have been thinking through. It's definitely a smaller scale than the larger political questions about democracies collapsing and markets using us, but maybe this is an interesting third counterpoint to say, what will happen to political action if we can no longer depend on stories to do the work that they were supposed to do?
Okay, thanks a lot, Nishant. I put back the gallery so that we can talk to each other. So, do you have questions, comments on your inputs?
I'll jump in just because it was so much fun to hear the talks. Thank you both. So first, Orit, I completely get the point about seeking to escape life in the body. I think that's absolutely something that's alive, especially in tech worlds. Really makes complete sense to me. And I thought that hiding in Nishant's talk was an alternative, and it's a theatrical alternative to this. And I kept thinking, I started listing, Nishant, places where in theatrical or storytelling modes there were excesses of joy. And I started thinking of black joy. I started thinking of drag. I started thinking of the cis white male version of drag, which is like duck hunters, right? Like, camouflage and in the South and, in Louisiana. These are all places where people theatrically express joy that exceeds the power of the story and bubbles through the story. And I as much as I get cranky about expressive individualism as a foundation of politics, I do know that when I see performances of these different styles of joy in communities to which I don't belong, I nonetheless take pleasure in my imaginative affiliation with them for that moment. And that gives me a chance to cross some boundaries that I might not cross otherwise in my life. And I think that's something that stories can do, even when stories are broken. Characters do it.
I guess I could say something. Thank you, Nishant, because actually, both of you for having such provocative interventions, and it was kind of funny because originally I was going to talk about crisis and resilience. But I think the interesting thing I was really thinking about as I listened to both of you was a narrative question about inevitability and history, and how we ourselves narrate the story of our technologies, and whether or not it has to happen. Like, what do these questions of desiring for self-expression have to attach themselves to these alt-right discourses? And most importantly, like, how have discourses of crisis and survivalism, I guess that's really kind of what I meant by neo-Malthusianism, come to predominate in terms of producing futurity right now, and to justify both reactionary politics and extreme and injustice, basically across the board. And so in that sense, I felt like we have our own work to break that question of inevitability, as well as our own demand aesthetically and narrationally. I don't know if I'm very good at it, and actually, because I'm a pessimistic optimist, like I'm kind of, things are going pretty badly, but somewhere I wouldn't write the book if it didn't matter, or I didn't think somehow it was like some little like drop in the puddle or whatever of something that would change things. But that there is this this real question about not just our own, like Sedgwick said, paranoid readings, but our own succumbing to the question of asking how we will survive rather than how do we wish to live, which I think is sort of fundamental to this. And the deeper question, which is, why does that seem to be somehow technologically augmented or intensified? Like, should not, like, on the same time, and again, coming back to the example of the Green Revolution, questions of things that seemed inevitable were not. And the question, and like I said, it fed new terrible agricultural monocropping. I'm not singing the praises of the Green Revolution, but I am saying that it demonstrates that certain notions of inevitability and population collapse and planetary crisis are not necessarily inevitable. And right now, it's really critical, and I guess Nishant really pointed that out, to really think about our narration, but also how we ourselves normalize this question of constant crisis in institutions in collapse, rather than asking questions about how they might wish to be, which is a really different question. And how do they survive? Like, how the university survives is a very different question than what type of university we would want. And so thank you both for bringing up that kind of critical issue, I think, in how we think about the futures of digital cultures.
Thank you. I think those are really, well, as expected, very articulate and insightful comments. While I was listening to both of your inputs, I think a couple of things that stood out for me is that there is a question of holding, and I'm using holding as a ambiguous term over here, because on the one hand it is holding as in financial holdings and futurity, but at the other hand there is also the idea of really just holding space and holding bodies together, which I think came out in Fred's conversation really interestingly, right? Like in a world of hyper individualized democracies, how do you hold something together? And what is interesting for me is when I reflect on the Doing Things with Stories project, is that we have been talking about who holds our joy. Who are we performing it for? So it was really interesting, Fred, that you would bring out this, theatricality of the excess, but that excess was not really being performed by us, the outsider. It was actually being performed only for the insider, and we just had glimpses of it here and there. And I think what they're suggesting is that the digital has taken away that space of intimate performances towards each other. What you now have is that excessive affect, which can only be realized as performing to something else. And one of the things that came out, and I found that very, again, helpful in thinking through our own research practices, a younger participant had looked at me and said, it's all really great that you are, kind of worried about these questions. Who holds your question? Like, are you first producing the question and then trying to address it? Or do you really have a community, a collective, a people, a country, a space where your question is being held? And for me, that was really nice because it moved away from questions of who are you accountable to? Because accountability leads to more managerial rubrics of how are you going to make sure that these things kind of happen. And instead it said, no, who is my affinity towards? And I'm kind of very curious about how you see the role of politics of affinity, especially in the very fractured things that you are both talking about.
I love this. Thank you, Nishant. And so I think you've got it. I just love the phrase of holding. I think that's exactly right. And the challenge I've found is when we begin to see one another's excess that is produced not for people unlike us, but for our own community, how do we encounter that excess? And how do we embrace or negotiate it when it might challenge our own understandings of how the world ought to be? I've spent a lot of time, much too much time, reading, the Christian right over the last few months, and their views are wildly challenged by things that I think folks on our call might just think are wonderful. And we've got to, I think, to find ways where folks can hold and engage with excess from worlds not like their own. And I think that's really a challenge. And without doing the thing that I think Orit is pointing us to, and that you were suggesting your friend was pointing us to, which is jumping back on top and saying, well, how can we plan this so that diversity occurs, right? Not doing that, but somehow making it work. And I think in both your comments and Orit's, there's another thing that we're pointing to, and it's the who question. Orit, when you describe the neo-Malthusians, I totally know who you mean, and I'm struck that you're describing a discourse that lives in very particular elite communities, and I think one of the things that we can do to become more optimistic is precisely to invoke other communities that speak differently. And one of the jobs I think of the neo-Malthusians, the neoliberals, the folks in governments and technology centers, is to produce stories of the way the world works such that their own desires become inevitable. And I'm an ex-journalist, right? I mean, I've studied folks who were definitely trying to hustle me, and so I think we can call bullshit on those hustles. And I think that's one of our jobs as academics, is to call. But to do that, we have to not only talk about discourse, we have to talk about the actual people and institutions that are producing discourses for particular purposes, and somehow marry that critique with an embrace of and a rethinking of how we might get expressive excess in a way that allows everybody to express, and it's just much more fun.
Sorry. Actually, I don't know who you're talking about. I'm talking Elon Musk. I'm talking the Christian right. I'm talking like everyday tax incentives. I'm not talking some special high elite. I think it's been kind of, I'm talking about the general discourse on reproductive decision making in the United States. And I'm also talking more broadly about discourses of survivalism and precarity in the way they're playing out in a whole slew of different things. And so I probably misframed it by saying it's neo-Malthusianism, except that I'm seeing again and again and reinstated in sort of discourses around economic growth, also the way people understand different communities and their relationship to around the discourses on immigration. We're seeing these discourses emerge that fundamentally understand the functionality and important validity of certain forms of bodies and not of others. And those non-others are perhaps the aged, they're perhaps the immigrant or the non-white, so on and so, and certain questions also around pressure for females to reproduce, frankly, and maybe even males at this juncture of history. So I think there's a huge question here that is not about a specific set of elites pushing some. I mean, they are elites. Elon Musk's discourse, for example, is extremely clear in this regard, and so is Peter Thiel's. But I think I'm talking a kind of a broader kind of racial and sexual logic that I'm concerned with right now. And I don't know where that sits really into all the holding and the excesses of care. I certainly have empathy for that, but I'd also say, planning is a bad word today in urban discussions and politics. It's what we've eviscerated. We're going to do everything bottom up. But I do have to say, and I don't mean just judicial activism, but there are times where perhaps we will have to be thinking about organization or preparedness or infrastructure even. Very often I worked with community-based groups where I talked to a lot of people in urban development, and I don't like to use the South North, but in places, let's say like Calcutta, people will say, it's great that we have these latrine building projects in our local community, but the water doesn't stop in your community, in your block neighborhood. Somehow we need a water infrastructure here, which we do not have, and a sanitation infrastructure that way exceeds any one community. And at some point, I'm not saying I want to go back to top-down planning, but I am going to say, I'm actually interested in buffering institutions that can make decisions not only intensely, but at scale. And I don't know what the new, there's so many places to be thinking about new processes, but I think that's an interesting question. I think that's come up in our discussion, is sort of this very, very tense relationship around trying to understand how we cite agency and what we understand as the institutional infrastructure. I haven't talked about infrastructure a lot here, but that was one of Martina's provocations. Infrastructure is these conditions of possibility, and sort of it's a chicken or egg problem about how that's going to emerge in terms of creating more conditions of possibility, let's say, for life. And again, a lot of my work has been around urbanization, so some really pragmatic things too. And the environmental management is a particular issue where we're negotiating all sorts of scales of things and intensities of things. To be honest, obviously precarity and certain types of are experienced very, very differently in one place versus another. So I don't know if that's exactly, maybe I'm not fully understanding, but I just kind of want to throw it in that maybe it's an interesting question about also incommensurability between discourses and translation. I love many of these ideas, but then sometimes I'm like, how would that actually work if I have to, put, and I don't want to fall just to material things, but even to things like the university or to educational infrastructures or to so many other things, that are operating. How do we, and maybe we don't have to. I think that's one of the things that we're trying to release in our technologies is they allow us to work diversely. But I think the real danger is to be like, it has to be this or that, like that we can have no planning, it has to be this way, or that we can have it. And I think it's neither one. I think there's like places for storytelling, places for kind of affectively encountering communities that are not your own. But sometimes there's, there may just be structures that have to be put away to get people to get together, even when we're not gonna be very open to, I have to some of those other forms of sentiment or different communities that fundamentally, because there are incommensurabilities sometimes, frankly, between communities of practice and action and thought.
Fred, do you want to jump in quickly? Because I think there is a conversation that's happening there. And maybe then I want to add a little bit. Thank you for bringing in infrastructure, because I do want to talk about stories as infrastructure and kind of what are the ways in which they are being narrativized, especially when it comes to political action. But maybe Fred, do you want to jump in first?
I just have a couple of quick things. I mean, I think I think we actually agree with our broad. I think we're actually in total sync with our broad critique. One of the things that I've noticed over the last 30 years is simply the ways that elites have mobilized formerly intimate interpersonal kinds of spaces for political gain. So Nixon very deliberately thought he was losing the working class and decided to start focusing on family issues as a way to get them back, even though he was economically predatory towards them. And I find that kind of fascinating. I think that infrastructure is a really interesting case here, because when we talk about infrastructures as scholars, we often, I think, leave out the other piece that's always critical to an infrastructure, which is the institution that produces and manages it. And so one of the things I think we have to be a little bit careful about is imagining infrastructures free of institutions and free of interested actors. Institutions are built by and maintained by people with interests. And that's, the best example of that would probably be the oil industry right now, or oil infrastructure in Europe. People built those things with interests, and they can destroy them with interests. And it's similar with Twitter. It's a corporation, and boom. So we need to just be thinking, as we think about infrastructure, we need to think about the institutions that are involved, and think about infrastructures, I would argue, not only in their enabling function with regard to users, but also their empowering function with regard to those who design, build, distribute, and manage them.
Yeah, good point.
I think the idea of institutions is actually a great segue for what I wanted to say. So thanks, Fred, because one of the things that happened in a lot of these conversations, which were focusing on the majority worlds, is that the nation state started appearing more as an actor. Like a lot of conversations which happen around digital technologies, especially in my part of the world, in Europe, and maybe also in the US, is that it's largely the market. Like there is a lot of conversations about what happens between the user and the technological infrastructure. But if you go to a space like India, I mean, the first address of all technological concerns is actually the nation state, which is both formulating itself as well as its ideas of what idealized citizenships are going to be. And the technology is almost seen as this thing which is going to reproduce the nation state instantaneously because of its very presence, right? So a lot of the tech infrastructure is actually governmental infrastructure as opposed to market innovation infrastructure. Like it begins with the state and its craft and so on. I don't know if you know the work of Asha Achyutan, who is a feminist philosopher of science. And she has a wonderful framework where she kind of looks at the entire history of how women and technology has been dealt with by the Indian state, where she talks about how the emergence of other historical technologies like telecommunication, for example, or print, but also now with specifically the internet, there was this idea that the emergence of the internet will lead to a paradigm shift because it's going to reinvent government itself, right? So if you look at like large projects like Aadhaar, which is still like the largest platform there is in the world of biometric information, which is unprotected by general protection, data protection regulation and privacy laws. The point is that the state infrastructure, coming to Orit, your point about inevitability, is that it is presented as infallible. It might be inefficient and it might fail many different times to achieve specific kinds of things which are put into place, but it will always be presented as infallible. And Asha kind of draws this wonderful cycle saying, once we accept the narrative that this technological infrastructure is infallible, we go into a pattern of, first we think about access. So there is a lot of like more physical investment into infrastructure, like in order to produce universal access, in order to build the gateways, in order to build citizen service centers, one computer in every village, and so on and so forth. And then once like the massive amount of investment in access has been done, we then come to the realization that while everybody might now have universal access, that does not mean that everybody has universal inclusion. So we move from access to inclusion as a different form of political action, saying we're now going to try and use this failed infrastructure of access to think about how it can include more people. So you'd have then a lot of more questions of literacy, questions of rehabilitation. In the ICT for D kind of a debate, there is also this question of the haves and the have-nots, and how do you bring the have-nots back onto the developmental scale and so on. And then once there is like a sizable amount of evidence that there are lots of people who are now included, which means that they are counted, it still means that they have no presence, or that they are technically included, but they don't really have a presence, they don't have a voice in decision making, they are not really acknowledged in setting up even future infrastructures for their own good and so on. And Asha says, and this is the sleight of hand, that once the access, inclusion, presence has failed, we go back to the older state and saying, now you have to give us rights. Now you have to make the digital into the rights. And that completes the cybernetic infrastructure, a cybernetic feedback loop of infrastructuring. Because now the government will say, well, Web 1.0 did not work, but we're now going to reinvent ourselves with Web 2.0, right? The technologies did not fail, the people failed in exploiting the potentials of it. So kind of that circularity, for me, that has been quite fascinating to think through. But this is also for me a condition of storytelling. Like, what would happen if we accepted all new technologies as necessarily predestined to fail, as opposed to predestined to succeed? And then what would it make? What kind of material choices would come into it?
I want to just jump in, and I don't want to step on toes, but I think that, Nishant, you're pointing to this other issue, which is always within technology, which is the question of the legitimation crisis, right? Technologies have to be legitimated in order to be deployed. You have to actually have them be legitimate, and stories do that work for us. They help us be legitimate. And I'm endlessly curious about the processes by which advertisers, marketers, manufacturers, CEOs, government officials tell stories into which technologies can be knit as examples and as prototypes. Historically, I would argue that's one of the functions of theater with regard to technology. John Cage, in many ways, legitimated the creative possibilities of the radio by turning it into a performance technology that could demonstrate a kind of democratic sensibility in what many people feared was a one-to-many, top-down, pseudo-fascist medium. And I think that's one of the things that theater really does for us. And you can see that with the arts out here in Silicon Valley. You know, Facebook has an enormous art collection. It's huge. They have a curator on every continent. And they have that collection in part so that they can show their workers, you know, look, we are the gatherers of symbols from around the world. Our process of gathering, our computation is just an extension of this benevolent process of taking all that is best in the world and best in human expression and celebrating it. Well, yeah, not so much. So the legitimacy work of stories, I think, is very important.
Yeah, I can just add that you just made me think of this, Fred, but also in terms of, Martina, your question of theater, obviously this question of the demo or the prototype or the version, which, like, you know, at least from its Media Lab genealogy was really much about performing technology and as a mode of reifying, even before it worked, even as a concept, as a mode of kind of justification. But Nishant, you said something interesting, which was this question of failure. And it's kind of really interesting because lately, this is more like a conversation with you. I've really been thinking about the questions of how we design in anticipation of failure, like resilient, like the anticipation, not only that we won't stop, say, climate change and the water is going to rise, but also like the assumption that certain parts of your city will be destroyed, and that like you kind of all that build that in, or the plan that, or the kind of tension between the fact that people are like everything's always already obsolete and we have to keep doing this. Or I mean, since you brought in India, I guess, and I've worked in South Korea, they also have lots of corporate collection. In fact, I don't think most of their art collections are corporate, actually. Samsung, Hyundai have amazing art collections, museum in Seoul. And there's a real interesting kind of like tech survivalist thing that both kind of creates this hyper nationalism constantly on the kind of fear of technological demise, so to speak, like that kind of and the need to constantly reinvent in advance an assumption of the failure of the technology. So it's a really interesting question you provoke about what it means to design for failure in a kind of progressive manner rather than a defensive one, and that's a really provocative question, I think, and a genuine one geopolitically, in the sense of the way that that there's so many large scale technical infrastructures where everybody knows they're going to go down, and this kind of but it becomes kind of a defensive or negative thing versus like the assumption that it'll go down as being a way to rethink our standard ideas of technophilia and progress. So those provocative. I'm still thinking through it. Like,
I mean, this is also now going into a conversational mode. I think the idea of failure was also and a very affective one for me. Because in many ways, I embody a lot of the privileges, which means that a lot of technologies which have succeeded for me. Like they have been catered for people like me to be able to become these transnational, global, interconnected citizens of different kinds. And then there was a realization of, the project was also kind of unfolding while the COVID-19 lockdowns were happening and people were feeling so both isolated and trapped. And then there was somebody who I can't name looked at us and they said, but technologies have always failed me. They are just failing me in new ways now. If they have succeeded for you, it basically means that you were just the target audience, right? Like they were never designed for me. I have only perverted, queered, negotiated my survival within those technological paradigms of different kinds. And that's where the theatricality also perhaps comes up. So Alexandra Yuhas and I, in our last book, Really Fake, talk about how there was this thing of technologies performing measurement of human beings, right? There has always been a history of how technologies measure us, and they have to, in fact, perform a variety of things, including replicability, error rates, different ways of correction, different forms of negotiation, and so on. And Alex and I make a point saying that within the digital spaces, we have now transitioned from technologies performing to us measuring up to the technological standards which are being set into place. That we are now performing two different kinds of technologies in certain ways. And in that particular shift, the original idea was that technologies will fail because there are errors. Now the new idea is that the human will fail because it will never measure up to the technological imaginary, because we are dirty, we are unstable, right? We are broken and we are irrational, and so we cannot be trusted. So that's also kind of failure for me, this particular idea that if technology succeeded for you, it only meant that you had the privileges of making it succeed for you, and that there were others who were always bearing the burden of it. Was kind of affective. It wasn't just a rational moment at that point.
Yeah, Sarah, I don't, Sarah Sharma, she has a nice thing about women as broken machines. Pretty much in line of what you were just saying.
Or also, like, a large, slightly older reference is also Kelly Dobson's neurotic robots, right? Like these robots which perform neurosis for you and kind of broke down in order to kind of just create this moment of anxiety, saying, oh my God, why is my machine not talking to me? And what do I need to do now? How do I change my haptic subjectivity in order for this interactive machine to speak back with me? I think those were interesting forms of designing for failure and designing with failure in mind.
In a way, if I follow your discussion correctly, it's like, as you also said, great global infrastructures and power plays of economics, and what Nishant brought in the how to do stories, how to bring how to do something in a way, and if I understood Orit correctly, there's a kind of pessimistic, more pessimistic attitude or a state of thinking and feeling. It's that the infrastructures, the big, great infrastructures and geopolitical problems will also always eat the ideas in a way of other storytelling, and you said in a way that there may be moments that we need structures, that we need decisions, that we need yeah. I would say it was just in a theater project that this was a very small history, little history, how to make another building or to tell other histories. And their idea was to be allies. So people not privileged, like me, old white lady at the university, I have to become an ally, and as an ally, I should carry ice blocks of ice in my heart and my, I don't know the English word, the Nieren, so down at the back, and then it was
the kidneys.
The kidneys, but then I dared to ask the question: if we have problems, if people have problems to come together, this is how to have access to the politics of affinity, of trying to be together, even if we don't understand each other. And they said, yeah, then one has to eliminate certain people. This shocked me, definitively, because for me it was like, yeah, so if other groups of social organization, if other groups of our society come to power, would it be better? Perhaps not. It would be different, but the result may be the same necropolitics we are living now with the concept of resilience. So yeah, I think the question what is what can we do also as teachers and artists to have both the big structures, the big infrastructures, and the big companies, and which are not made for us to be more human or social or more solidarity, and to not kill each other when the moment will come of crisis. And I don't know, yeah, how to bring. I don't know. It's not a question. It's perhaps doch it's a question. How not to kill each other when the moment has come of big of problems that we don't have enough to eat, not enough water, not enough or perhaps this is that I already fall into the trap of the narrative of crisis, and it's inevitable and we will all die, and I don't know, which is also of course a regime of to guide me and to oppress me and to obsess my thoughts. But there may be, yeah, so there's a kind of solidarity. And another example is for me that there was in a German newspaper on theater and structures, there was a lady like being a dramaturg in the theater, and she said, yeah, now we have more diverse collectives in our theaters, but I'm still in German. We have there's the table for the parents and the Katzentisch, the table for the children. We still have the system. So now the people of diversity, the diverse system is that I am still at the table for the adults and the other at the Katzentisch as a table for the children. I have to go back. I have to sit on another table. I have to decide. So this is in the individual again. We spoke about, could we find a positive idea of individuals and individualism and like a collective individuum, or I don't know what to stay back. And I often have the idea of all this living labs in cities, and so we are very busy with them, but then we don't see the problems. So we are giving energy and finding solutions, and then yeah, it's yeah, we are exhausted afterwards, too exhausted to find solutions for the problems. I don't want to be pessimistic or to destroy things, but this is what came up, that there may be like two sides, and in the in between we are speaking together and thinking for possibilities.
Thank you for bringing that out, Martina. I don't think that's pessimistic, but I understand I think there is a sense of anxiety that all of us share about what next. And I think that's also perhaps a good way of wrapping this up, at least for me. I'll leave you with three very small stories from the Doing Things with Stories project, where these activists who told us that despair is the privilege of those who can afford it, said, sorry, no, we're not going to sit there and wring our hands and saying, what can we do now? Because we'll do things. And there were three things that came about. One, the Doing Things with Stories invites people to write mini-festos. So not manifestos, but mini-festos, like small calls for action and small stories to be told, because there is a need to be telling those stories. They're not often dramatic. They're not often a response to crisis. They're just stories. As Neha Singh, who's one of our collaborators, says, we don't always have to tell stories about doing. We also can tell stories about being. And Neha organizes one of the largest public art and women's campaigns in India. It's called Why Loiter, where she says that the point with our contemporary idea of collectivization is that we need intention. We need to come together to do something, to protest, to march, and so on. And she says, no, I build collectives for loitering. We come out and we just hang. She invites women into public spaces that they would never go to unless they had an intention, they had a purpose, they had a defined route. They go into the metros of Mumbai trains and then they play singing games with each other. So how do you kind of just loiter? How do you come together without an intention, without having to do something? I think that's been one way of thinking through this. The second story is from Sabah Khan, who runs this incredible Muslim girls collective in India called Parcham. And Sabah organizes football matches for Muslim girls who come and play football, wearing even sometimes their hijabs and their burqas and with all the traditional attire and so on. And Sabah says that, of course, India is right now facing an increased Islamophobia. Of course, there is a lot of conversations around the Muslim body and especially the Muslim female body, because India has been passing a lot of legislation around divorces, the marital and conjugal autonomy of the female Islam body, and so on and so forth. And she says, yes, all of there exists, but in the middle of that, there's also joy. There are also a lot of other things that Muslim women do, and one of the things they do is play football. So how do you kind of make space for recognizing that just because a body has been identified in crisis doesn't mean that that's the only narrative that we frame it in, right? What are the other kinds of things which might emerge in it? And maybe the third, and which all of us had found incredibly funny but also transformative, was this exercise that Alejandra and Elena, who are both from Peru and Mexico City, had made us do, which was actually role playing. They invited us to confide our stories into each other and then forced us to tell other person's story, right? How do you role play somebody when you don't know enough about them? And how do you kind of rewrite them and so on? So I think there are these new interventions which are needed. There is also, I think, a lot of possibility for digital infrastructures to actually facilitate this in ways in which it was never possible before. But I just want to hold on to this idea of a manifesto, saying I don't think I have world-changing theories or actions, but I think making space for the small actions to happen is something that I still want to hold on to. And maybe that's what we need to do with stories. We need to make them small, and then we need to do things with them in small ways.
Yeah, I also want to say, I said I was a pessimistic optimist, which is to say, you can be critical of the moment and still think there's change possible. And I want to reiterate, I didn't say that there's some big infrastructure. I think that there's diversity, and that it's really important to keep hold of that there's both people living their lives every day, but then there are infrastructures, there are bigger organizations, but they're not monolithic. Even a corporation is made up of people, tactics, technologies. It takes a lot of work to run a corporation or a market. It takes a lot of work to maintain ideologies. It takes a lot of stuff, which is why it's really important for us to be thinking about all those levels, which means that interventions also can operate at ever more scales and in different places, So just as a kind of pessimistic optimist, all this stuff is true if people keep going on with their lives, right? So, and we still.
I think as we move toward wrapping up, I want to agree with that. I want to see if I can bring the two perspectives together. I think it's a both and problem. We both need manifestos and storytelling and the kind of enlivening that can happen when we gather together with a few folks and play roles of people that we aren't yet. I mean, that's wonderful. We need that, but we still also need to fight the power in the very traditional sense of looking up and seeing the very large systems that are being built around and for us and calling those out. And I would argue that as academics with institutional resources, we have a unique responsibility and a unique ability to really call bullshit on power. And not power in the Foucauldian sense, but power in the institutionalized, dominating oil industry, mining the world and destroying it sense. And I think that is also our challenge. And our challenge is, how do we do both? How do we enable people to live a life of intimate, explosive pleasure, and at the same time challenge large systems that are trying to monopolize, capitalize on, and manipulate those forms of pleasure?
Absolutely. Sometimes it is about just getting out the vote.
Sometimes it really is. Yeah, sometimes it really is.
A big proponent. I'm back to, like I said, civil rights beyond human rights.
Orit, man, it's great to meet your mid-century liberal. It's really great.
Apparently I'm back to the Keynesian state. I don't know. I had my critique point, but but now I'm sort of like, I don't know. And I'm not, God forbid, but I do admit it's true that we, political representation is a critical and central feature or important to act upon.
Oh. And it's such a paradox. We live at this moment of intense opening up. So many things are visible and knowable and playable that were never knowable or visible or playable in my youth, certainly. And that's just amazing. And at the same time, we live in this era of, intense, centralized, authoritarian deployment of oppressive power by institutions. And how do we balance that?
Again, so I completely understand the paradox, Fred, but I also think that as we work more with people who have historically never been on the right
Yep.
side of that power, it's more to
Yep.
say that the power's always been there. It's just that this time we are it. It is affecting us in ways that never affected us before, and so we were kind of oblivious to it. And I think one of the biggest affordances of digital cultures and this, as you say, the excessive opening up of things is precisely this. It's not just opened up the world; it's opened a lot of us who were protected.
Yeah, fair. No, that's right.
Towards experiencing different kinds of precarity, and we are waking up and saying, oh wait, this happens to me, and then there are like thousands of people who like, yeah, it's always happened to us. I mean, where
Fair
have you
point.
been living?
Of
Fair
course.
point. Very fair point. Yeah, good point.
That's a really big thing in the discussion on civil rights is just not, they're non-actualization. Like, it's actually an abnormality in American history to even have any legal or institutional even wish, if you will, even if it's unfulfilled wish image for any form of guaranteeing equity or entry. And almost as immediate as it happened, it was, responded to by the alt-right that you were discussing with Nixon. And so that is an absolute reality, that there's sort of the kind of democracy that has yet to come or has never been. So I think that that's a critical feature of this whole discussion, of course.